Now let us turn to the events of the last 2 decades, particularly those that have come about through the 9/11 attacks and what subsequently became known as the Global War on Terror. Indeed, since 9/11, Islamist terrorism has largely defined the international security agenda of the 21st century. And some commentators have noted that the talk in the 1990s of a new terrorism appeared to be validated by this Islamist form of terrorism. And so a variety of claims have been made about how distinctive this terrorism might be. Some have pointed to the fact that it is religiously motivated rather than secular. Again, we could think of it in terms of the fourth wave. They've also pointed to the fact that the goals of Islamist groups have tended to be very global, absolutist, irreconcilable, and that these contrasted with more limited, negotiable, often territorial objectives. The new terrorism is also thought to be transnational, to operate in loosely organized networks, in contrast with tighter hierarchies and national groupings associated with older forms of terrorism. Finally, there's a claim that new terrorism is unrestrained, seeks indiscriminate targeting of mass casualties, even the use of weapons of mass destruction. Again, with a contrast with more limited, calculated uses of violence. So, in this view, of course, new terrorism is much more akin to an expressive form of terrorism than it is to an instrumental one. And certainly, I think all these categories do seem like quite a good fit for an organization like Al-Qaeda. But it's certainly not exclusive to it. We've already discussed how anarchist groups, for instance, already held very grand global objectives and were often transnational and operating in very loosely organized networks. So it is not as if Al-Qaeda has completely radically transformed terrorism in an unprecedented fashion. It simply operates at one end of the spectrum. Moreover, we should be careful not to generalize too quickly from a group like Al-Qaeda to all expressions of Islamist terrorism. Al-Qaeda certainly is best understood as a disparate network, or rather one element within a wider transnational jihadist movement. Within it, we see a limited centralization or formalization of organization, with also very little territorial grounding. This has prompted the analyst Mark Sageman to speak of a leaderless jihad. The jihadist movement doesn't really have strong leaders. It's a very disparate constellation of organizations and individuals. And this network form has considerable benefits, certainly in terms of flexibility and survivability. You can't really decapitate the jihadist movement because it doesn't have a head, so to speak. This is something that has been actively theorized by Al-Qaeda strategists. Abu Musab al-Suri, one of the strategists of Al-Qaeda, pictured here with Osama bin Laden, developed the notion of leaderless resistance in his call for a global Islamist resistance, expressly arguing for a network form of organization. Another theorist, Al-Qurashi, explains that America today is facing a huge problem with Clausewitz's theories. The latter are premised on the existence of a centralized hostile power with a unified command. Assuredly, the Mujahideen, with the Al-Qaeda organization in their vanguard, believe in decentralized organizations. Thus, the enemy cannot ascertain the center of gravity, let alone aim a mortal blow at it. But again, we should be careful here to draw a distinction between transnational jihadists like Al-Qaeda and locally implanted Islamist groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah, or even the Taliban. There is an important difference to be made between organizations seeking to achieve goals within the confine of the state form and those seeking much wider goals of a global ummah under a new caliphate. IC Zarakol has notably drawn a similar distinction by noting how terror groups can, in relationship to the Westphalian system, to the system of nation states, fall in either the categories of system-affirming or system-threatening groups. System-affirming groups are groups who really all they seek is their own place within the Westphalian system. They want a state of their own. They don't fundamentally oppose the Westphalian state system. They don't renounce the system of state sovereignty. They simply want their own state sovereignty. System-threatening groups are, on the other hand, present a much more radical challenge to the Westphalian system. They do not believe in states, and they do not seek ultimately a state form. So, of course, anarchist groups fall under this category since they're opposed to the nation state. New left organizations from the 1960s and 70s also, in their desire to overthrow capitalism and to bring about some form of socialist paradise, were also system threatening. And groups like Al-Qaeda have, of course, in their adoption of a very expansive notion of a ummah, also reject the state system. I mean, they are radically opposed, generally speaking, to the pre-existing Islamic states as they exist today. For Faisal Devshi, therefore, the global jihadist movement is quite specific in the sense that it exists outside what he calls the politics of control, beyond what he says, or what he calls the rationality of intentions. He notes, for instance, that there is no clearly defined ideological or political corpus to Al-Qaeda. Certainly it has broad grievances and aspirations, but it doesn't ever articulate, or has ever articulated, definite political demands, or aligned itself with any clearly defined theological doctrine or affiliation within known schools of Islamic law. In many ways, the ideology of Al-Qaeda owes more to Western revolutionary ideas of the vanguard, of the propaganda of the deed, than it does to Islamic tradition. Devji also notes a certain abdication of control over the effects of attacks. The kind of unrestrained violence deployed by Al-Qaeda is almost a roll of the dice. There is no attempt to calibrate that violence in accordance with particular objectives. This prompts Devji to conclude that the actions of this jihad, while they are indeed meant to accomplish certain ends, have become more ethical than political in nature, since they have resigned control over their own effects, thus becoming gestures of duty or risk rather than acts of instrumentality, properly speaking. So what Devji is saying is that for participants in global jihad, the adoption of the cause is more often an ethical commitment rather than a political one. That it is not political in the sense that it doesn't seek limited, rationally achievable goals. Indeed, it's not determined by the achievability of the goals. It is a commitment to a cause, to a certain sense of injustice, to a belief in a certain faith, but again, one that's quite disparate, doesn't really fit into existing theological traditions. And so in that sense, is in a sense an ethical commitment. Let me say a few words about the phenomenon of Islamic State that, of course, has defined the war on terror for the last decade or so. And in some ways, of course, has surpassed Al-Qaeda. Islamic State is interesting and perhaps it would be even misleading to talk about Islamic State as a single entity, because in many ways it has morphed in and out of transnational jihadism. It coalesced briefly in Syria and in Iraq into a territorial organization, into a state, or something approximating a state, which it understood somewhat as a new caliphate, and in doing so began to adopt some of the trappings of a state form: bureaucracy, internal policing, and so forth, before, of course, collapsing under its adversaries' attacks. Islamic State has now dissolved back into transnational jihadism. So we see within the history of the Islamic State, or ISIS, or Daesh, or however way you want to call it, a fluctuation between more state-bound, territorially bound forms and the more transnational jihadism. If the Islamic State had to survive, in many ways, it probably would have had to adopt many of the trappings of a state. It would have had to eventually, in a way, temper its ambitions to survive. And this has been the tradition for most revolutionary states, is that in order to survive, they become quite conventional states. The past of the Soviet Union is quite emblematic in that regard. So there's quite a lot that could be said about the Islamic State, but I think it rather supports the case that we've been making so far. Finally, to the globalization of jihad, we should see a correlated globalization of counter-terrorism. One of the effects of jihadism and of terrorism becoming this major policy item within the 21st century is that it has created a massive infrastructure of counter-terrorism, a global projection of force and of a coalition of state security forces and militaries, alongside punctual projections of force, which increasingly look like an indefinite military condition. Today, US counter-terror operations cover 40% of the world's nations. And despite the receding of the narrative of the war on terror, we barely hear that term being used anymore, the infrastructure of counter-terrorism persists and is an important dimension in understanding the nature of contemporary conflict today and beyond of global geopolitics.